Hello and welcome to a special two-part note in which we're going to be talking about emerging markets. Now, most of us know that emerging markets did very well indeed during the last decade and that they haven't done very well at all for the last 3 years. But there is a much deeper history to them than that, which can give us a lot more guidelines on how we should try to play emerging markets in the future. It's all part of this fascinating report, the Credit Suisse Global Investment Returns Yearbook for 2014, which has done very impressive new historical work on emerging markets going back to 1900. With me now is one of the authors of the report from London Business School, Elroy Dimson. Elroy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, really pleased to be with you.
Okay, let's start by taking a look at the grand picture, going all the way back to 1900. How did you put together this version of how emerging markets done, and what is the big story? Emerging and developed markets have been more similar to each other over much of history than many people would have assumed.
Yes, I think it's important to explain how we've put together a long-term index because nobody has done that previously. Emerging market indices came into existence in the late 80s and in some cases, FTSE for example, only during the 1990s. And there are a number of different suppliers of emerging market indices. They use a large number of different criteria to determine when a country is emerging and when a country is a developed market.
Right.
And our task was to try to replicate their analysis in order to go back much further in time.
And as I understand it, you're able to do that quite simply just by looking at GDP per capita.
That's absolutely right. What we discovered was that if instead of using what is typically 20 plus different attributes, if we simply classified countries according to their GDP per capita in dollars, then apart from two countries at the margin, we would classify countries as being emerging or developed just the same way as the index compilers, who are themselves remarkably similar in how they decide what is an emerging market. So GDP per capita, of course, is available all the way back to 1900.
Brilliant. So let's take a look at the pattern by decade. Blue is for the emerging markets. So we can see the last 2 decades do stick out as being rather unusual. The great decade where emerging markets lost out was the 1940s. Why was that happen? Why did that happen?
In the previous line plot, you saw a drop, and that's dramatized here in 1940. So what we've done is we've put together a history of markets which were classified as emerging markets because of their low GDP per capita. Amazing. And we've then run a portfolio through time which contains the countries that are identified as being emerging. So, for example, in the 1940s, that included Japan and it included China.
Right.
Japan lost almost all its value in relation to the Second World War, and China lost all of its value over the 1940s through the communist takeover.
Thanks to Chairman Mao, whose photo adorned the screen earlier. Now let's take a look at volatility over time. Obviously one would expect emerging markets to be more volatile, but the picture, as I understand it, is of quite dramatic reduction in volatility over time, with the occasional spikes for crises, but a clear reduction in volatility over the last 3 decades.
So let's look at the blue line. What the blue line is showing you is how volatility for emerging markets moves up and down over time. What the red line is doing is dividing that volatility by the volatility of developed markets so that we can see the relative risk. It starts with emerging markets being almost double the risk of developed markets, and on the right-hand side, we're down almost to white 1.0. So what we can see is that as markets develop, they have become less risky.
Okay, and on the subject of risk, obviously when you want to control for risk, it helps if you can find non-correlated assets. If we look at how correlations have changed over time, however, plainly emerging markets are more of a correlated investment than they used to be. They're not as much of a diversifier as they used to be. Is that a fair statement to take from your work on this?
Yes, markets do appear to move more closely together now than they used to. There's still a worthwhile benefit from diversification, and it is more accessible because in modern times one can get exposure to emerging markets much more cheaply than one could in the days when the diversification was desirable, but the costs of gaining it were high.
Okay, Elroy, thank you very much indeed. Join us for a second segment in which we're going to be taking a look at how the internal mechanics of trading in emerging markets differ from developed markets.